Jack Morrison stepped into his restaurant, Morrison's Grill, on a cold, damp Tuesday evening in Chicago. To Jack, this wasn't just a restaurant, it was the culmination of his life's work, a place where every dish told a story and each meal was crafted to be an unforgettable experience. Yet recently, something felt off. The online reviews were glowing, the sales steady, and his staff seemed content. But a nagging feeling lingered, an uneasy sense that he'd somehow lost touch with the true heart of his business. Determined to reconnect, Jack decided to do what he always did when he felt out of step: go undercover. Not as a server or a chef this time, but as an ordinary customer. Dressed in a dark hoodie, worn jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, he slipped unnoticed through the restaurant's front doors, blending in seamlessly with the bustling crowd. No one gave him a second glance, just as he'd hoped. He was just another diner on a busy evening. Jack made his way to a table tucked in the back corner, taking in the scene before him. The restaurant was alive with energy. Servers moved deftly between tables, balancing plates of sizzling barbecue and trays of colorful cocktails. Couples whispered to each other over candlelight, while families shared laughter and bites of dessert. Settling into his seat, Jack allowed himself a moment to observe. He wasn't here to enjoy a meal, but to see Morrison's Grill through the eyes of the people who mattered most, his customers. Pride and unease warred within him as he watched his vision come to life in ways both familiar and strangely distant. But then, his quiet moment of reflection was interrupted. Low voices from the table behind him caught his attention. Two boys, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, sparked Jack's curiosity. "Are you sure this is the place he'll show up?" one boy asked, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Mom said he comes here a lot," the second boy replied, his tone more resolute. "We just need to wait." Jack's chest tightened. Who were they talking about? Their whispers stirred something inside him, an odd mix of intrigue and foreboding, as if their words had some hidden connection to him. He strained to catch more of their conversation, his heart pounding. This wasn't the simple undercover visit Jack had planned. These boys were here for someone, and their words carried an urgency that hinted at a larger story. As Jack sat there, his mind raced. Could it be possible that they were talking about him? If so, what truth was he about to uncover that he had never expected to face? Jack Morrison took in the lively scene around him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Morrison's Grill was alive and thriving. The chatter of diners, the clinking of glasses, and the aromatic swirl of roasted meats and fresh spices filled the air. A cheerful waitress approached his table, her practiced smile warm and inviting. "Good evening. Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Just water, thanks," Jack replied casually, keeping his tone neutral. He wasn't ready to risk being recognized. "And, give me a few minutes to look over the menu?" The waitress nodded, scribbling a note before walking away. Jack leaned back, opening a menu he could recite from memory. But tonight, the dishes weren't his focus. His real purpose was to listen, to immerse himself in the unfiltered hum of his customers' experiences. This was his opportunity to reconnect with the essence of his restaurant, the people who filled its tables and gave it life. As Jack began to relax, his thoughts were interrupted by voices from the booth directly behind him. Two boys, speaking in hushed tones, caught his attention. "Do you think we'll even see him?" one of them whispered, his voice high-pitched and jittery as if unused to being stealthy. "I don't know," the second boy answered, his tone sharper and more resolute. "But Mom said this is the place. She said he's here all the time." Jack's ears pricked up, curiosity sparking. Who were they talking about? He kept his head down, feigning interest in the menu, but his entire focus shifted to the boys' conversation. Their words carried a weight, a purpose, that made his pulse quicken. What did they mean by he? And why did they sound so determined? Jack's instincts told him there was more to their whispers than idle chatter. Yet, as he pieced their words together, a strange unease began to settle over him. Could their murmurs somehow lead back to him? He held his breath, trying to catch more without drawing attention to himself, his heart racing at the thought of what he might uncover. Jack pretended to study the menu, but his mind was entirely focused on the boys behind him. Their words stirred a growing unease. "What if we get caught?" the first boy asked, his voice trembling with nerves. "We're not even supposed to be here." "We won't get caught," the second boy replied sharply. "We just need to figure out who he is." Jack frowned, his curiosity deepening. Who were they looking for? At first, he brushed it off as kids being kids. Maybe they were searching for a local celebrity or pulling some kind of prank. But there was something about their tone, something urgent and personal, that unsettled him. "M said it's his fault everything went wrong," the second boy continued, his voice dropping lower but carrying a sharp edge. She said if it weren't for him, we wouldn't be living like this. Jack's breath hitched and his pulse quickened. His fault? The word struck a nerve, sharp and direct. He gripped the menu tighter, the laminated pages crinkling slightly in his hands. Who were they talking about? And why did it feel like the blame they were throwing might land squarely on him? Before he could process further, the waitress returned, her cheerful voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "Ready to order?" she asked brightly. Jack hesitated, glancing at the menu as if he had been reading it all along. "Oh, I'll just have the house special," he said, his voice a little too casual. "Great choice," she chirped, jotting it down before hurrying off to the next table. The moment she was gone, Jack leaned subtly to the side, his ears straining to catch more of the boys' conversation. Their voices were lower now, harder to hear, but the weight of their words lingered in his mind. They weren't just kids killing time, they were here for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it seemed tied to a deep resentment, one that Jack couldn't ignore. His thoughts raced, his stomach tightening with unease. Were they talking about him? If so, what had he done to cause such bitterness? The questions swirled in his mind, leaving him unable to focus on anything else. He had come here seeking connection and understanding, but it seemed he had stumbled onto something far more complicated and deeply personal. Jack strained to catch more of the boys' conversation, careful not to draw attention to himself. Their voices carried a rawness that unsettled him. "Mom said he ruined her life," the second boy muttered, his tone thick with resentment. "That he took everything from her." "Do you think he'll even care?" the first boy whispered, his voice tinged with doubt. "Like if we tell him?" "I don't know," the second boy replied, his voice hardening. "But I want to see him. I want to see the guy who made us lose everything." Jack's stomach dropped, the weight of their words hitting him like a punch. They weren't talking about some faceless stranger. They were talking about someone they believed was responsible for their mother's pain, someone they held accountable for shattering their lives. And the way they spoke, filled with such raw, unfiltered bitterness, sent a chill racing down Jack's spine. Were they talking about me? The thought clawed at his mind. It didn't make sense. Jack had always prided himself on running his business with integrity. Sure, there had been tough decisions, employees who hadn't worked out, hardball negotiations with suppliers, but nothing he could recall that would justify such damning accusations. Could there be something he missed? A blind spot in his past? The boys' voices dipped lower, making it harder to hear. Jack leaned slightly closer, frustration mounting. Every word they'd spoken so far had planted a seed of doubt, a gnawing suspicion that refused to be ignored. His heart thudded against his ribs as he considered his options. He couldn't just sit here in silence, letting their conversation twist into a storm of guilt and questions. He needed to know what, or who, they were talking about. But how? Confronting them outright seemed reckless, especially if he was the person they were here to see. If he revealed himself, it could escalate the situation. Yet staying quiet might mean he'd never get the answers he needed. Jack's mind raced, balancing the risk of action against the unease of inaction. He took a deep breath, his grip on the edge of the table tightening. No matter what he decided, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary dinner, and he couldn't just walk away from it now. Confronting the boys directly felt too risky. If they truly were talking about him, revealing his identity could make an already tense situation spiral out of control. But staying silent? That might mean leaving without the answers he desperately needed. Jack felt trapped between his instincts and his fear, the weight of uncertainty pressing heavily on his chest. He drew in a steadying breath and glanced toward the booth behind him. The boys were young, likely no older than 13 or 14. One had a mess of curly hair sticking out from under a hoodie, while the other kept his face partially hidden beneath a baseball cap pulled low. Both looked uneasy, their eyes darting around the room, as if expecting someone to catch them at any moment. Their nervousness made them seem out of place, but the conviction in their words earlier told a different story. They were here for a purpose. Jack's mind churned with possibilities. Should he discreetly call over the waitress and ask about them? Maybe wait for them to leave and follow at a distance? Or should he take the boldest route and confront them directly, asking outright who they were looking for? None of the options felt ideal, but he couldn't just sit there, letting the tension gnaw at him. Before he could decide, the boy in the hoodie leaned closer to his companion, his voice barely above a whisper. "We just need to wait a little longer," he said. "If he's here, we'll know." Mom said he wouldn't hide. The words hit Jack like a jolt. He wouldn't hide. They felt like a challenge, a direct accusation aimed at someone with something to answer for. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and a chill crawled down his spine. The implication was clear. Whoever they were looking for wasn't just a faceless antagonist in their story. They believed him to be someone bold, someone unapologetic, someone who wouldn't cower behind a disguise. For the first time, Jack felt truly exposed, as if they could somehow see through his carefully constructed anonymity. He tightened his grip on the edge of the table, questions racing through his mind. What had he done? Who was their mother? And why were they so certain he was the man responsible for her suffering? Jack sat frozen, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt, guilt, and the overwhelming need to uncover the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't something he could ignore. Not anymore. Jack's heart raced, his pulse quickening as the reality of the situation settled in. His quiet undercover visit, intended as a simple way to reconnect with his restaurant, had taken a sharp and unexpected turn. This wasn't about food, service, or customer experience anymore. This was personal. The boy's words lingered, each one cutting deeper than the last. Mom said he ruined her life. Took everything from her. Who was their mother? And what connection did she have to him? Jack couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that their accusations might somehow be aimed at him. But he didn't have answers, not yet. One thing, however, was certain. He couldn't just walk away. Whatever was happening, it demanded more than quiet observation. Deciding to take a cautious first step, Jack adjusted his cap and slid out of the booth. He moved toward the counter near the kitchen, where he could keep an unobtrusive eye on the boys while appearing casual. Leaning lightly against the counter, he motioned to the waitress who had taken his order earlier. "Hey," he said, his tone deliberately light. "Those two boys in the back, do they come here often?" The waitress followed his gaze and studied the boys for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No, I don't think I've seen them before." "What? Are they causing trouble?" "No, nothing like that," Jack replied quickly, brushing off the implication. "Just curious." She shrugged and walked away, leaving Jack to his thoughts. He glanced back toward the boys. They were still deep in conversation, their heads close together, occasionally darting nervous glances around the room. They didn't look like troublemakers, but their presence felt purposeful, like they were here for a reason, and Jack had a sinking feeling he might be the reason. He exhaled slowly, trying to piece together what little he knew. Who was their mother? What had happened to make her blame someone so deeply? And why did these boys seem so convinced that he was the man responsible? Jack's mind raced with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Whatever the truth was, Jack knew one thing. This wasn't going to be the quiet, reflective evening he'd planned. It had already become something far more complicated, and he was in too deep to turn back now. The waitress shrugged and walked away, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. He turned his gaze back to the boys, their whispered conversation drawing his attention like a magnet. They didn't look like troublemakers, just two young teens, but their words suggested a deeper purpose. They weren't here by chance. The more Jack replayed their murmurs in his mind, the more a sinking certainty took hold. They were talking about him. Returning to his booth, Jack sat down, his unease growing. The boys remained engrossed in their conversation, their voices low but charged with intensity. "I just want to know why," the boy in the hoodie muttered. "Why he did it. Mom never tells us the full story." The boy in the baseball cap hesitated, glancing nervously at his companion. "What if it's not him?" he asked, doubt edging into his voice. "What if we've got the wrong guy?" "It's him," the first boy insisted, his tone unwavering. "Mom showed me his picture. It's definitely him." Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. "They've seen my picture." His chest tightened, and a wave of anxiety washed over him as fragments of memories bubbled to the surface. Faces, names, moments from years ago, blurring together in a chaotic mess. But nothing specific stood out. Who could their mother be? What had she told them about him? His heart pounded as he considered his options. He couldn't sit there any longer, silently piecing together half-formed suspicions. The boy's words hinted at something deeply personal, something Jack had either forgotten or never realized. And the weight of their accusations, their certainty, was too pressing to ignore. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Jack made a decision. He stood, inhaling deeply to steady his nerves. His hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists to calm himself. If he wanted answers, he would have to take a direct approach, no matter how risky. With his heart hammering in his chest, he began walking toward the boys' booth, his steps measured yet purposeful. As he approached, their conversation faltered, their voices dropping even lower. The boy in the hoodie glanced up first, his eyes narrowing as if he sensed something. Jack's pulse quickened. He didn't know how this confrontation would unfold, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. Jack approached the boy's booth, his movements calm and deliberate. As he neared, both boys stiffened, their wide eyes darting up to meet his. They were on edge, their guarded expressions making it clear they weren't expecting company. "Hey," Jack said gently, sliding his hands into his pockets to appear non-threatening. "I couldn't help but notice you two seem a little uneasy. Is everything all right?" The boy in the hoodie straightened in his seat, his face hardening as he replied curtly, "We're fine." Jack nodded, ignoring the defensive tone. "That's good," he said, his voice steady. "I just thought, well, I overheard you mention someone earlier. Someone who might be here. Are you looking for someone?" The boys exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. The one in the baseball cap fidgeted nervously, while the boy in the hoodie squared his shoulders, trying to project confidence. "Why do you care?" he asked, his tone sharp and wary. Jack hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He couldn't risk revealing too much or spooking them. "I just thought," he said slowly, "maybe I could help. If you're looking for someone, there's a good chance I might know them." The boy in the hoodie narrowed his eyes, studying Jack's face intently. Jack held his ground, keeping his expression neutral. But then, as if a realization struck, the boy's expression shifted, his eyes widening slightly. "Wait a second," the boy said, his voice dropping to a tense murmur. You look familiar." Jack's heart sank, his stomach knotting with dread. He forced a small, awkward laugh, trying to deflect the observation. "A lot of people say that," he offered, his voice light and unassuming. "I must just have one of those faces." But the boy wasn't convinced. His gaze sharpened, his suspicion growing. Jack could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and he knew the situation was slipping out of his control. The questions he'd hoped to answer were now dangerously close to being directed at him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what might come next. "No," the boy insisted, his voice rising, cutting through the low hum of the restaurant. "You're him. You're Jack Morrison." The second boy gasped, his face paling as he turned to his companion. "Are you serious? Is it really him?" Jack felt the floor drop out from under him. The weight of the accusation, the sharp certainty in their voices, left him momentarily frozen. There was no use denying it now, they'd already seen through his disguise. "Yes," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. "I'm Jack Morrison. But, how do you know who I am?" The boy in the hoodie glared at him, his green eyes blazing with an anger that caught Jack off guard. "Because of what you did to our mom." Jack blinked, his mind spinning as he tried to process the words. "Your mom?" he asked, baffled. "I'm sorry, but I don't even know who." "Yes, you do," the boy snapped, cutting him off with venom in his tone. "Angela Carter. Remember her?" The name hit Jack like a thunderclap, reverberating through his mind. Angela Carter. His thoughts scrambled as memories began to surface. Years ago, Angela had worked for him as a sous chef, young, ambitious, bursting with talent and ideas. She'd been determined to leave her mark on the culinary world, and Jack had admired her drive. But one day, without warning, she'd quit and disappeared from his restaurant. She hadn't left an explanation, and over time, her absence had faded from his thoughts. "Angela," Jack said slowly, the name heavy on his tongue. It felt foreign now, a relic from a life he'd all but forgotten. "She worked here, didn't she?" The boy's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. "She didn't just work here," he spat. "She gave everything to this place. She helped you build it. And what did you do? You ruined her. You took everything from her." Jack stared at the boy, his breath catching in his throat. The intensity of the accusation was staggering. "Ruined her?" he murmured, his voice trembling. I don't understand." The boy's glare deepened. "She told us everything. How you stole her ideas, her recipes, and claimed them as your own. How you made sure she couldn't get hired anywhere else. You destroyed her career." Jack reeled, his mind struggling to reconcile the accusations with the reality he thought he knew. The image of Angela flashed in his memory, her quick smile, her endless creativity. Could he have been so blind to her struggles? Could his ambition have crushed someone else's dreams without him even realizing it? He began, his voice faltering. "I need to understand. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." But the words sounded hollow even to himself. The boys stared at him with unwavering anger, their pain stark and undeniable. Jack realized this wasn't just about Angela's story, it was about facing the truth of what he'd done, whether he had meant to or not. "She gave everything to this place," the boy in the hoodie said, his voice rising with emotion. "She helped you build it. And what did you do? You stole from her. You took her recipes and claimed them as your own. You made sure she couldn't get hired anywhere else. She told us everything. Jack stared at the boys, his mind spinning. The accusations hit him like a torrent, each word cutting deeper than the last. That's not true, he said, his voice trembling. I never. Why would she think that? Because it's the truth, the boy shot back, his green eyes blazing. You ruined her life. You ruined our lives. The second boy, quieter and more hesitant, finally spoke up, his voice softer but no less piercing. She said you were jealous of her. That you couldn't handle someone else getting the spotlight? Jack felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He struggled to catch his breath, his thoughts racing as he searched his memory for any clue, any fragment that could explain what had happened all those years ago. Had he made mistakes? Had he been so consumed with building his dream that he'd failed to notice someone else's crumbling beneath the weight of his ambition? His mind flashed with images of Angela, her creativity, her determination, her eagerness to contribute. Could he really have taken advantage of her without even realizing it? The idea filled him with a sense of guilt and dread. Jack straightened, his voice steadying as he forced himself to speak. I need to talk to your mom, he said finally, his tone firm but calm. If what she told you is true, I need to hear it directly from her. Please, will you let me talk to her? The boys exchanged a wary glance, their guarded expressions hinting at a mixture of uncertainty and reluctant trust. After a long pause, the boy in the hoodie broke the silence. She's not here right now, he said cautiously. But if you really want to know the truth, you'll have to come see us. Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. Then I will, he said, his voice laced with determination. He had no idea what awaited him, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this. Not now, not ever. The rain had turned into a steady drizzle by the time Jack Morrison arrived at the modest apartment complex the boys had directed him to. The building stood in stark contrast to the world Jack had grown used to, old and weathered, with peeling paint and cracked sidewalks. As he stood beneath the dim glow of the porch light, a pang of guilt washed over him. If what the boys had said was true, if Angela Carter's life had unraveled because of him, then he owed her far more than an apology. He owed her the truth and perhaps something even more difficult. Redemption. The creak of the door jolted Jack from his thoughts. Standing there was Jacob, the older of the two boys. His expression was guarded, his green eyes studying Jack carefully. You came, Jacob said, his voice a mix of surprise and lingering distrust. Jack nodded, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. I need to understand, he said, his voice steady but tinged with unease. Where's your mom? Jacob hesitated, his face tightening as if he were weighing whether to let Jack in. Finally he stepped aside. She's in the living room, he said, his voice quiet. Jack stepped inside, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with evidence of a life lived modestly yet with care. Family photos lined the walls, faded but lovingly arranged. The faint scent of something floral lingered in the air, softening the starkness of the space. As Jack's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he spotted her. Angela Carter. She sat on a worn but neatly kept couch, her face partially illuminated by the glow of the television. Her auburn hair, now streaked with gray, framed a face that still bore traces of the passion and determination he remembered. But her eyes, those once bright eyes, were heavy with exhaustion and the weight of years gone by. Angela, Jack said softly, the name feeling foreign yet familiar on his tongue. She looked up at him, her expression flickering between shock and cold resentment. Jack Morrison, she said, her tone sharp and distant. I can't say I expected to see you here. Jack stepped closer, his voice earnest. Angela, I didn't know it was you. Your boys, they told me what happened. I need to know. Did I? He paused, struggling to find the right words. Did I hurt you that badly? Her eyes narrowed, and she set the remote control down with deliberate calm. You don't remember, do you? She asked bitterly. Of course you don't. People like you never do. Jack's chest tightened. Angela, I'm not here to argue, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I honestly don't remember doing anything that could have destroyed your life. Please tell me what happened. Angela leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest. You want the short version? Fine, she said, her tone cold. You stole from me, Jack. My ideas, my recipes, everything that made me who I was in that kitchen. I trusted you and you used me. And when I finally stood up for myself, you made sure no one else would ever hire me. Jack stood frozen, her words hitting him like a slap. Memories from years ago began flooding back, her creative sparks, her dedication to the kitchen. But her accusations? They painted a picture he barely recognized. Could he have done so much damage without realizing it? I need to hear it all, Jack said quietly. Not just the short version. Please, Angela. I need to understand. Family photos adorned the walls, capturing snapshots of lives lived with quiet care. A faint floral scent lingered in the air, softening the starkness of the modest apartment. Jack's eyes landed on the woman sitting on the couch, her figure partially illuminated by the flickering glow of the television. Her once vivid auburn hair was streaked with gray, and the determined spark that had once lit her eyes was dulled by years of weariness. Yet even through the layers of time and hardship, she was still unmistakably Angela, the ambitious, passionate woman Jack remembered from his kitchen so long ago. Angela, Jack said softly, his voice faltering as he stepped further into the room. She looked up, her expression shifting between shock and cold resentment. Jack Morrison, she said, her tone sharp, each word weighted. I can't say I ever expected to see you here. Jack took another step forward, his voice laden with guilt and urgency. Angela, I didn't know it was you, he began, his words tumbling out in earnest. Your boys, they told me what you said about what happened. I need to know, did I really hurt you that badly? Her eyes narrowed and she set the remote control down with an air of finality. You don't remember, do you? She asked bitterly, her voice carrying the edge of a wound long festering. Of course you don't. People like you never do. Jack felt her words like a punch to the gut, the weight of her bitterness pressing against him. Angela, I'm not here to argue, he said, his voice breaking slightly under the strain. I swear to you, I honestly don't remember doing anything that could have destroyed your life. Please, tell me what happened. Angela leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest as she studied him with a guarded glare. You want me to explain? She said, her tone laced with cold disbelief. Fine. But don't expect me to go easy on you. Jack nodded, his throat tightening as he prepared to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. This wasn't just about her story, it was about finally understanding the consequences of his past, and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to make things right. Destroyed your life? Jack echoed, his voice shaking slightly. Please, Angela, tell me what happened. Angela leaned back against the couch, crossing her arms over her chest. Her expression was cold, her voice laced with bitterness. You want the short version? Fine. You took credit for my work. All those dishes that made your restaurant famous. Most of them were mine. I trusted you, Jack. I thought you were mentoring me, helping me grow. But you weren't. You were just using me. Jack's brow furrowed as her words settled over him like a heavy weight. Angela, that's not how I remember it, he said slowly, his voice tinged with both disbelief and defense. You were part of the team, an important part. But I never claimed your work as my own. Angela's eyes flashed with anger, her voice rising as she shot back. Then why did every article about Morrison's Grill mention your name and only your name? Why did you ignore my contributions? And when I finally confronted you about it, what did you do? You blacklisted me, Jack. No one would hire me after I left. Jack's stomach churned as her words hit him. Blacklisted? He repeated, his voice breaking. Angela, I would never. Yes, you did, she snapped, her voice trembling with anger and pain. I tried to get jobs at every major restaurant in the city, and every time I was turned away. It was like someone had put a mark on my name. I had to leave the industry entirely. And now, she gestured around the modest apartment, her voice softening into something that carried more sorrow than rage. Now I'm here, barely getting by, working a job that doesn't even come close to what I'm capable of. Jack stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He could feel his world tilting, the confidence he'd always held in his integrity crumbling under the accusations. Had he been so consumed with building his dream, his reputation, that he'd unintentionally crushed hers in the process? Or worse, had his ambition blinded him to the harm his actions might have caused? Angela, I swear to you, he said finally, his voice raw, if I had known, if I'd realized what was happening, I would have done something. I never wanted this. Never. Angela shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. It's too late for that, Jack. The damage is done. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving, leaving Jack to grapple with the crushing realization that he had a debt far greater than an apology to repay. A job that doesn't even come close to what I'm capable of, Angela finished, her voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. All because of you. Jack's heart sank. He hadn't been aware of any blacklisting, but that didn't mean it hadn't happened. He thought back to the early days of running Morrison's Grill, a whirlwind of pressure, mistakes, and, yes, moments of selfish ambition. Could his drive to succeed have unintentionally crushed Angela's career? The idea hit him like a brick. I didn't know, Jack said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. Angela, I swear to you, if I had known, if I'd realized how my actions were affecting you, I would have done something. Angela let out a bitter laugh, her eyes narrowing as she shook her head. It's too late for that, Jack. The damage is done. A heavy silence filled the room, the weight of her words pressing down like an unrelenting storm. Jack glanced toward the hallway where her sons stood watching. Their faces carried a mix of anger, confusion, and something else, perhaps a flicker of hope. Jack turned back to Angela, his resolve hardening. It's not too late, he said firmly, his voice clear and steady. I can't undo the past, but I can try to make things right now. Angela's expression remained guarded, her arms still crossed over her chest as she studied him warily. Angela, Jack continued, leaning forward slightly, you're an incredible chef. I always knew that. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a position at Morrison's Grill, a senior position with full credit and recognition for your work. I want to give you the chance to create, to lead, to be seen and celebrated for the talent you've always been. Angela blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Her hardened expression softened slightly, though her distrust lingered. You think you can fix this with a job offer? She asked, her voice shaking. Do you really think that's enough? No, Jack admitted, his tone unwavering. It's not enough. This isn't about fixing anything or erasing the past, it's about giving you what you deserve. I can't change what happened, Angela, but I can give you the platform you should have had from the beginning. Angela's gaze dropped for a moment, her guarded posture faltering as she processed his words. Jack held his breath, hoping she could see the sincerity in his offer. Finally, Angela looked up, her expression a mix of vulnerability and lingering skepticism. I don't know if I can trust you, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Jack nodded. I understand, he said. I don't expect your trust right away. But please, at least think about it. Angela's eyes met his, and for the first time they softened, just a little. I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Relief swept over Jack, though he knew this was only the beginning. As he glanced at her sons again, he saw them watching intently, their expressions now carrying a glimmer of cautious hope. Jack turned back to Angela, determined to show her and her family that his words weren't empty. Whatever it took, he would prove that he was ready to make things right. You deserve this, Jack said, his voice steady and sincere. Angela's eyes widened, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face as she processed his words. For a brief moment, the hardened exterior she'd built up over the years seemed to crack. But just as quickly, her defenses rose again, and her expression hardened. You think you can just buy my forgiveness with a job? She asked, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. No, Jack said, shaking his head firmly. This isn't about buying forgiveness. It's about giving you the opportunity you should have had from the start. I can't erase what I did, Angela. But I want to help you get back to doing what you love. You don't have to forgive me, but please at least think about it. Angela stared at him, her emotions flickering across her face. Anger, pain, confusion, and something that almost resembled hope. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own uncertainty. I don't know, she said softly, her voice tinged with doubt. I don't know if I can trust you. You don't have to decide right now, Jack replied, his tone gentle but insistent. Take your time. Whatever you decide, I want you to know. I'm sorry. Truly. For the first time, Angela's expression softened, the sharp edges of her guarded demeanor dulling ever so slightly. She looked at him, her eyes still wary but less cold than before. I'll think about it, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, a small spark of hope flickering to life within him. He turned to leave, his steps slow and deliberate, as if carrying the weight of the entire encounter with him. Just as he reached the door, Jacob's voice stopped him. Hey, the boy called out, his tone softer, less hostile than before. Jack turned back, meeting Jacob's gaze. Do you really mean it? Jacob asked, his words cautious but curious. About helping her? Jack looked at him, his eyes earnest. I do, he said simply. Your mom deserves that much, and more. Jacob studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he gave a small nod, a glimmer of reluctant belief in his eyes. Okay, we'll see. As Jack stepped out into the cool drizzle of the night, he felt a strange mixture of guilt, relief, and resolve. He knew the road to redemption would be long and uncertain, but for the first time he felt like he was taking the first real step toward making things right. Jack turned back and met Jacob's gaze, his expression unwavering. I do, he said sincerely. Your mom deserves that much, and more. Jacob studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally the boy gave a small nod. "Okay," he said, his tone cautious but less guarded. "We'll see." Jack stepped out into the rain, the cool drizzle soaking through his jacket. A strange mixture of emotions swirled within him, guilt, relief, and a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to walk it. Redemption wouldn't come quickly or painlessly, but it was a path he had to take. In the days that followed, Jack was consumed by a blur of emotions. The encounter with Angela and her sons had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just guilt he felt, it was a profound sense of responsibility. For years he had built his success on the foundation of others' hard work. While he had never intended to hurt anyone, his blind ambition had clearly left casualties in its wake. Now he was determined to make things right. Sitting in his office at Morrison's Grill, Jack stared at the scribbled notes he jotted down after meeting Angela. Ideas, plans, and promises filled the pages, but one truth stood out among the chaos. He couldn't change the past, but he could take meaningful steps to acknowledge it and create a better future, for Angela, for her sons, and for himself. Jack picked up his phone, his resolve hardening as he dialed the number of an old industry contact. As the line connected, a familiar voice greeted him. "David," Jack began, leaning back in his chair. "I need your help. Do you remember Angela Carter?" There was a brief pause before David replied, surprise evident in his tone. "Angela? Of course I remember her. She was one of the most promising chefs I've ever met. What happened to her?" Jack hesitated, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. He admitted, his voice low. "I made mistakes and she paid the price. I need to make it right." David listened quietly as Jack explained everything, the accusations, the boy's words, Angela's pain. When Jack finished, David spoke thoughtfully. "If you're serious about fixing this, the first step is making sure people know who she is and what she's capable of. The industry needs to hear her story." Jack nodded, even though David couldn't see him. "That's exactly what I was thinking," he said. "Thanks, David." Hanging up the phone, Jack stared out the window at the rain streaking down the glass. His mind was already turning over the next steps, sharing Angela's contributions, creating a new position for her, and ensuring that her voice was finally heard. It wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start, a way to begin rebuilding trust and honoring the incredible talent he had once taken for granted. Leaning back in his chair, Jack Morrison felt the weight of his next call. He dialed the number, and after a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "David," Jack began, his voice steady but laced with tension. "I need your help. Do you remember Angela Carter?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a tone of surprise. "Angela? Of course I do. She was one of the most promising chefs I've ever seen. What happened to her?" Jack hesitated, his throat tightening. Finally he spoke, his voice low with regret. I made mistakes and she paid the price. I need to make it right." David listened quietly as Jack recounted the events, Angela's accusations, the boy's anger, and his own crushing realization of the harm he might have caused. When Jack finished, David sighed thoughtfully. "Well," he said, "if you're serious about this, I think the first step is to get her story out there. The industry needs to know what she's capable of. Let them see the talent you overshadowed." Jack nodded, even though David couldn't see him. "That's exactly what I was thinking. Thanks, David." As Jack hung up the phone, a sense of purpose replaced his earlier uncertainty. He immediately set a plan into motion. He contacted food critics, local media outlets, and industry leaders, sharing Angela's significant contributions to Morrison's Grill and highlighting her talent and creativity. At the same time, he worked on a new position for her at the restaurant, a co-head chef role with full creative control and the recognition she had always deserved. A week later, Angela Carter stepped into Morrison's Grill for the first time in years. There was no grand announcement or celebration, but the atmosphere was charged with a quiet, respectful acknowledgement of her presence. The staff, many of whom had never met her, had heard her story from Jack. They looked at her with admiration, sensing the importance of her return. Jack met her at the door, his expression earnest and filled with gratitude. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady but humble. Angela nodded stiffly, her expression guarded but resolute. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But Jacob and Ethan, they convinced me to hear you out." Jack offered a faint smile. They're smart kids. You've raised them well. Her features softened for a moment, a flicker of warmth breaking through her reserve. They just want me to be happy, she said quietly before adding, even if I'm not sure I can trust you. I understand, Jack replied sincerely. And I don't expect your trust right away. But I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I mean what I've said. Angela didn't respond immediately, but she followed him into the kitchen, where he laid out the details of the role he'd created for her. The staff watched from a distance, sensing the weight of the moment as Angela took in everything Jack had to say. For the first time in years, it felt like there was a path forward, not just for the restaurant but for both of them. The staff, who had heard her story from Jack, looked at Angela with quiet admiration as she stepped into Morrison's grill. Though she had no fanfare to greet her, the significance of her return was palpable. Jack met her at the door, his expression earnest and hopeful. Thank you for coming, he said sincerely. Angela nodded stiffly, her body language guarded. I almost didn't, she admitted. But Jacob and Ethan, they convinced me to hear you out. Jack smiled softly. Your boys are smart. You've raised them well. For a fleeting moment, Angela's expression softened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. They're good kids, she said, her voice quieter now. And they just want me to be happy even if I'm not sure I can trust you yet. Jack nodded, acknowledging her hesitation. I understand, he said. And I don't expect your trust right away. But I hope you'll give me the chance to prove that I'm serious about this. Angela said nothing, but she followed him into the kitchen. The once familiar space hummed with activity as staff worked, but they stepped back slightly, aware of the gravity of the moment. Jack led Angela to a quiet corner of the kitchen where he laid out his proposal. This is what I've put together for you, Jack began, his tone steady but filled with conviction. A co-head chef role with full creative freedom. And I've also prepared a public acknowledgement of your contributions to Morrison's Grill. He slid a draft of a press release across the counter, detailing Angela's pivotal role in the restaurant's early success and celebrating her talent. Angela picked up the paper and read it carefully, her face a mask of unreadable emotions. Jack watched her nervously, his heart pounding as the silence stretched between them. Finally, Angela looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never thought I'd hear you say any of this, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. It's a lot to take in. I know, Jack replied gently. Take all the time you need. There's no pressure, this is about what you want. Angela nodded slowly, still holding the press release. Though she didn't say it outright, something in her expression had shifted. The weight she carried for years seemed to have lightened, even if just slightly. Jack could see it, the faintest glimmer of possibility, that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something meaningful out of the wreckage of their shared past. Take all the time you need to decide, Jack said, his voice soft but sincere. No matter what, I want you to know how much I regret the way things turned out. Angela was silent, her gaze fixed on the counter as she turned his words over in her mind. Finally, she looked up, surprising him by extending her hand. Let's see if we can make this work, she said, her voice steady but cautious. Jack took her hand, relief washing over him like a tide. I won't let you down, he promised. Angela's return to Morrison's Grill wasn't without its hurdles. Rebuilding trust took time, and the wounds of the past didn't heal overnight. There were awkward silences, moments of hesitation, and the unspoken weight of old grievances. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. The tension between Jack and Angela eased, replaced by a tentative partnership. Together, they started crafting new dishes, blending Angela's bold and imaginative ideas with Jack's refined techniques. The results were extraordinary. The restaurant thrived, garnering praise from critics and diners alike for its innovative menu and the collaborative genius of its two head chefs. Morrison's Grill became a culinary destination, not just for its food, but for the story of two people working together to create something greater than themselves. One evening, as the restaurant buzzed with the energy of a full house, Jack stepped into the kitchen. He found Angela standing at the stove, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. What's so funny? He asked, approaching her with curiosity. Angela glanced at him, her smile widening. I was just thinking about how far we've come, she admitted. If you told me a month ago that I'd be back here working with you, I wouldn't have believed it. Jack chuckled, leaning against the counter. Honestly? Neither would I. Angela turned back to the stove, her smile lingering. It's not perfect, she said, her tone thoughtful. But it's a start. Jack nodded, his expression softening. A good start, he agreed. For the first time in years, the restaurant didn't feel like just a business to Jack. It felt like a community, a shared dream. And as he watched Angela stir a simmering pot, her focus intense and her confidence unmistakable, he realized that together, they were creating something far more meaningful than just food. They were crafting a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of second chances. His tone warm. But I'm glad you're here. The place feels complete now. Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's not perfect, she admitted, but it's a start. As the weeks turned into months, Jack began to see Morrison's Grill in a new light. It wasn't just a business anymore, it was a community. A place where people came together, sharing ideas, creating something greater than themselves. Angela's return had been a reminder of what truly mattered, recognizing and valuing the contributions of everyone who had helped build that community. Her sons, Jacob and Ethan, became regular visitors to the restaurant. At first, their distrust lingered, their interactions with Jack tentative and guarded. But as they watched their mother thrive, her confidence returning with each dish she created, their wariness began to dissolve. Bit by bit, curiosity and pride replaced their initial skepticism. They saw their mother in her element, commanding the kitchen with the same passion she'd once thought was lost. One evening, as the boys sat at a table near the kitchen, Jack approached them with a smile. They looked up, their expressions a mix of surprise and interest. "You know," Jack said, leaning slightly on the edge of their table, "your mom is one of the best chefs I've ever worked with. You should be proud of her." Jacob studied Jack for a moment, his serious expression making him seem older than his years. "We are," he said simply. Then after a pause he added, "And I guess we were wrong about you. A little?" Jack chuckled, reaching out to ruffle Jacob's hair. "I'll take it," he said with a grin. The sound of laughter mingled with the hum of the busy restaurant. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace. He couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, but he was learning how to move forward, how to create something meaningful and authentic. As Jack glanced toward the kitchen, he saw Angela plating a dish with meticulous care. She looked up briefly, catching his eye, and for a fleeting moment, they exchanged a small, knowing smile. It wasn't perfect. The road to redemption rarely was. But it was a beginning, a foundation on which to build something better, something enduring. And as Jack turned back to Jacob and Ethan, seeing the pride in their eyes as they spoke about their mother, he knew they were on the right path. Together they were creating a story of resilience, trust, and the quiet power of starting over. For the first time in years, Jack Morrison felt a profound sense of peace. The weight of his past mistakes lingered, but he understood now that redemption wasn't about erasing them, it was about trying, learning, and growing. As he stood near the edge of the bustling restaurant, Jack's gaze landed on Angela and her sons. They sat together at a table, their laughter mingling with the hum of conversations and the clinking of silverware. The same space that had once been a source of so much pain and bitterness now echoed with warmth and connection. Jack watched as Angela's smile widened, her eyes lighting up in a way he hadn't seen before. Her sons leaned toward her, sharing stories and jokes, their pride in her clear in the way they looked at her. It was a scene that seemed almost surreal, yet it was happening right there in the heart of Morrison's Grill, a restaurant built on ambition now transformed into a place of reconciliation and hope. He knew the journey was far from over. The path ahead would be filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but for the first time, Jack felt prepared to face them. Redemption wasn't a destination but a journey, a process of continuous growth and effort. And as he watched Angela and her boys share a moment of joy in a place that had once held only pain, Jack realized something important. This wasn't just about making amends. It was about building something new, a future shaped by the lessons of the past and the resilience to start again. The road would be long, but Jack Morrison was ready to walk it. The journey was just beginning. The story of Jack Morrison and Angela Carter is not just a journey of redemption but also a profound reminder of the value of recognition and compassion. In life, there are moments when we unintentionally or deliberately hurt others while pursuing our own ambitions. What truly matters is whether we have the courage to face our mistakes, make amends, and rebuild broken relationships. This story stirs deep emotions because it mirrors the realities we often encounter: misunderstandings, forgotten pain, and the necessity of learning to understand one another. Angela represents those who have been hurt but never completely lost hope, while Jack symbolizes change, a willingness to step out of his comfort zone to admit his faults and find ways to make things right. Their emotional collaboration not only revived Morrison's Grill but also their connection, demonstrating the transformative power of reconciliation. Looking back, this story reminds us that life is rarely perfect. However, with sincerity and determination, we can turn mistakes into opportunities for growth. This is not just a story about food but also about humanity, perseverance, and the power of forgiveness. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to ensure you don't miss more touching stories like this one. And please share your thoughts in the comments. Who knows, the next story might be about you or someone you care about. Sparkling heart. Humans are born into this world to learn from their mistakes and from how they treat others. Don't hesitate to face and admit your faults when you're in the wrong. The moment you dare to take responsibility for your mistakes is the moment you become extraordinary, rising above the small, selfish nature within yourself. See you in many more upcoming videos.